Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
Adam, let's talk about passwords this week.
My favorite.
Everybody's favorite topic.
Attackers' favorite, that's for sure.
Well,
Attackers
back in
love
2016, we've been talking about this on the show for a while, but in 2016, Microsoft actually published some guidance around passwords. And back then, this was pretty groundbreaking revelations for the security industry in general. But I'll read through some of these recommendations here. So first off, again, remember this was back in 2016. Maintain an 8-character minimum password length. And they wrote in here, and longer is not necessarily better. And I think over time, we've discovered that longer passwords are usually better because, it takes longer to brute force those type of passwords. But along with that, Microsoft recommended eliminating character composition requirements, eliminating mandatory periodic password resets for user accounts, banning common passwords, educating your users not to reuse passwords for non-work related purposes, enforcement of registration for multi-factor authentication, and enabled risk-based multi-factor authentication challenges. So this again was back in 2016, and I think the biggest one was rotating passwords on a regular basis. Why we're talking about it this week was NIST started updating their password guidelines for 2024. The last time this was done was back in 2020, and there was an update in 2017. The special publication series governing passwords is SP 800-63, which is called Digital Identity Guidelines. The 2024 version is 800-63. Back in 2017, a year after Microsoft came out with this password guidance, it actually started recommending that passwords should not be rotated. There was a sub-bullet in there for 5.1.1.2, memorized secrets. Verifiers should not require memorized secrets to be changed arbitrarily. They should not be changed on a schedule, but rather when a breach or compromise or user request happens, then you can change your password. And back in 2017, just like when 2016 with Microsoft's password guidance, this NIST guidance in 2017, not many people saw this or paid attention to it, or they were like, that's just crazy. Why would we not rotate passwords? And then this was maintained in the 2020 version, which again, 3 years later, still, we had people not really paying attention to this requirement. Now in this 2024 update, we went from verifiers should not to verifiers and CSP shall not require users to change passwords periodically. However, verifiers shall force a change if there is evidence of a compromise of the authenticator. And then also, again, verifiers and CSPs shall not impose other composition rules requiring mixtures of different character types for passwords. So we went from should not to shall not, which is a very small, nuanced change, but huge when it comes to compliance, because it's now dictating that you will not do this instead of like, you could or should, but now you shall not. So this goes for Active Directory, all of your systems. They should have the same password requirements that align with these guidelines if there isn't another standard or framework that you have to adhere to as an organization. But most of these frameworks have moved away from arbitrary password resets and complexity rules. So, it's the same thing with complexity rules. When you enforce that, we've talked about patterns and how people are used to composing these passwords in the way that we compose sentences or the human language. So when you require capital letter, lowercase, numbers, and punctuation, most people will start with a capital letter, then followed by probably 7 characters or whatever your length is, of lowercase letters, followed by a number, which is usually 1 or 01 or the year 2024, and then followed by an exclamation mark because we're all very excited about passwords. So it does not take a whole lot to guess. Like if I went to a bunch of Wisconsin companies and did a single password spray with the password Packers 2024 exclamation mark with a capital P, of course, I guarantee you I will get at least one hit, if not more. I mean, that's just guaranteed. Every single company that you go to will have that. And so we need to start enforcing things that are not composition rules, but more like educating our users to use passphrases and also checking against a block list. You know, we have passwords that should be banned, like the word password or the word monkey, or even like a crawl, you know, keyboard crawl. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But also, if you live in a geographical area and you know a password is very common in that area, then you should ban that too. In Iowa, I would assume Hawkeyes or Cyclones would also be on the list of passwords that you would want to eliminate or ban from your organization because they're going to be very common. So in this new update, it also mandates that you shall compare the prospective secrets against a block list that contains known, commonly used, expected, and compromised passwords. The entire password shall be subject to comparison, not substrings or words that may be contained. So not only are you not supposed to do periodic checks, but also in the new update, you must compare it to a known block list, which is also a big change.
This is great. There was a lot of enthusiasm when this came across Twitter. A lot of folks retweeting and reposting the good news of NIST 800, what is it, 63, 800-63, yep, being updated to include this. And Andy, I like how you provided all the historical context. I arrived at Microsoft early 2017. So that password guidance was 9 months old when I arrived. And I, for one, thought I was at a relatively cutting edge IT shop. Prior to joining, had never seen anything like that. I mean, my mind exploded when I saw that password guidance for the first time. And then NIST started to adopt it the following year. And as you pointed out, it's been a journey, but now 7 years later, it's now, if you want to align with NIST 800-63, you shall follow this guidance, which means you will no longer require regular rotation. You will check against a block list or a list of otherwise known compromised passwords or common phrases or that sort of thing. This is phenomenal news. This is great. And what it really emphasizes is the fact that passwords don't exist in a vacuum. They're not just a math problem. It's not just number of characters times number of positions times this equals number of possibilities. And then, running that against whatever the current state of the art is for password cracking. No, that's a math problem, but humans don't work that way. And so we need to incorporate some of the nuances of what humans are and aren't good at into password design. And ultimately, again, we're talking about passwords. I don't like to spend a ton of time talking about passwords because I think it's opportunity cost away from moving to truly passwordless solutions. So passwords, I saw a way it was positioned several years ago at an Ignite presentation. Passwords plus FA are a mitigation. It's not a solution. It's not a long-term strategy we want to dig our heels into. It is a bridge technology to get us to passwordless technology. Saying, I want to stay on password plus 2FA forever is not a good strategy. It's, again, we're just trying to get us to a better place. And so all of this guidance is with that context in mind. We are, of course, trying to have secure passwords and have secure second methods. We talked about token theft a week ago and how that impacts the usage of multi-factor solutions as well. But ultimately, the solution for all of those things, what we talked about last week, what we're talking about this week, is get to truly passwordless. I don't want to bury the lead there on that. You should snap to this guidance if you're required to, and you don't have another compliance framework that supersedes it. It is exciting to hear that other compliance frameworks are getting on board with this as well. I will say I still see a ton of this happening. And so I don't know what the root cause is. I don't know if it's other compliance frameworks, if it's just IT folks being slow to acknowledge the change, if it's people wanting to think about this as a math problem and not a human problem. But I love the direction here, and I love the specificity of it as well. One of the things that compliance frameworks like this are very good at is being very specific and very prescriptive in what you need to do. So overall, really exciting stuff. If you're a listener of this show and you've been trying to preach the good news of getting rid of password rotations, your day has come. And the cavalry has arrived to back you up in forms of the US federal government and the NIST standard saying you shall not require periodic password rotation arbitrarily anymore. So this is a great win. And it does speak to how long this stuff takes to happen too. Again, I like the context of you go back to June of 2016 to here we are October of 2024. So more than 8 years between that initial publication from Microsoft to this widespread, now broader like demand. You will do this if you're snapping to this standard. So it takes a while for policy to trickle down and for changes to happen. But if you're listening to this show, if you're watching this show, you're already at the crest of the wave because you are in that growth mindset. You're in that learn it all mindset, and you want to hear the latest and greatest and adopt it sooner as opposed to later. And that's a great place to be. As security professionals, so much flies at us all the time, but we gotta stay current on this stuff. And so this is a great opportunity to do that and bring it to your organization.
Microsoft does have password policy recommendations on our official documentation. And a lot of it takes after this original document, which is still good to read through. Both of the links will be included in the show notes, but in the official documentation on Microsoft Learn, it talks about how good password practices fall into a few broad categories. Resisting common attacks, so involving the choice of where the users enter the passwords into known and trusted devices with good malware detection and validated sites, and the choice of what passwords to choose, length and uniqueness. It also talks about containing successful attacks. So containing a successful attacker, a hacker attack is about limiting exposure to a specific service or preventing that damage altogether if a user's password gets stolen. So for example, if you ensure that a breach of your social network credentials doesn't make your bank account vulnerable, or letting a poorly guarded account accept reset links for an important account.
That's that point right there around containing successful attacks. Andy, you and I both used to work with a gentleman who I wish we should get him on the show someday maybe, but Daniel Stefaniak used to work for Microsoft in our identity space. And he was a bit abrasive in front of customers, to put it mildly. But one of the things he would do is walk in the room and write his password on the whiteboard. Say, there's my password, knock yourself out. Because he knew there were so many other layers of protection that the password being compromised alone was nowhere near enough to compromise his account. And having that confidence for all your users that it's just a small piece of the puzzle is a great state to be in. So, while we're talking about securing passwords, that broader context in mind of a password should just be one small piece of the puzzle.
Then we touched on this just earlier, but understanding human nature. Many valid password practices fail in the face of human nature because every rule that you impose on your users results in a weakening of password quality. Length requirements, special character requirements, password change requirements all result in the normalization of passwords, which make it easier for attackers to guess or crack passwords. So in the example that I talked about, right, my password just happens to be coming up for expiration because the company that I work for, Contoso or whatever, requires a password change. So it comes up in the fall. Well, I'm going to try fall 2024 ! First, then maybe autumn 2024, or maybe Packers. Or if the Brewers are in the playoffs in September, then maybe I'll do Brewers 2024 ! And then 6 months later, it's spring. So you make me change my password 6 months later, it's spring. Now I do spring 2025 ! Or the Brewers are playing. It's opening day for baseball. So Brewers 2025 exclamation mark. I have successfully changed it, but it still makes it extremely easy to guess, right? And so that's understanding the human nature here, that rotating passwords, people are just going to increment slightly, but still have an extremely weak and guessable password.
Right. You talked about all those, how we snap passwords to our understanding of like the English language, where punctuation goes at the end, capitals go at the beginning. It creates that normalization, those patterns where you have not really added any complexity at all because it's so predictable in terms of what's going to be in each position, to where if I want to brute force it, I'm not brute forcing like actual random passwords that have like X's and Y's and Z's in the middle positions, because there aren't any words in English that do that hardly, and no one's using them for their passwords. So I don't need to guess capitals in the middle. And modern brute force technology does account for that. Like you can say, use this format and only suggest things like this, and significantly shorten the time. So again, it's not a true math problem of I have 52 plus 10 numbers plus how many symbols per position, so multiply those together. It's not that. It's not close to that. And so that's very helpful to understand why this falls short.
So we do have password guidance in the official documentation on guidelines for administrators, which is exactly the same as that document that I went over in 2016, with the exception of Microsoft recommends that administrators have at least a 14-character password as a minimum requirement. And then everything else, risk-based conditional access and signals and MFA and so on and so forth. And then for users, we talk about, making sure that they know that they're not using a password that's similar to the ones that you use on other websites. Don't use a single word or common phrases like I love you. You want to make passwords hard to guess, even by people who know a lot about you. Like, don't put your name in there, or birthdays, or your favorite band, or anything that you would like to use. And then, while we encourage users to think about a unique password, we recommend keeping at least a reasonable 8-character minimum length on that. And I would also say, as a side note for administrators, sometimes I will go to a site and make a password and it'll say this character is not allowed. Talk about frustrating. Exclude any of the characters. Let them use spaces if you want.
Mhm.
If I want to use a full sentence, that should be allowed.
Great. Please do.
Exactly. So don't exclude any characters. Don't have an upper limit on passwords. I think there are a few sites that have like 12 or 16 character limits. It's like, why? We have modern technology. You could have up to 128 or however many characters or bits or whatever you have for that. I mean, 128 characters, no one's really going to be brute forcing that, right? So, but there shouldn't be an upper limit other than like maybe computational bits or something like that in your program that might, throw things off depending on your programming language, which I understand, but it's certainly not at 12 characters or 16 characters.
Yeah. I mean, this is all great guidance. And Andy, you and I talked a little bit on the pre-show before we went on the air about the password guidance here, especially length. Administrator length is recommended to be 14. And then you and I kind of did a little bit of 8 for users. 8 at a minimum. I've seen organizations do this that have moved to modern password practices. They communicated it somewhat like this. Hey, users, we're not going to make you reset your passwords anymore. We're not going to make you have character composition requirements anymore. We're going to make it way simpler. But we do have an ask in return. And that is, we're going to set the new minimum to 16 characters or 12 or whatever, something more than 8. And it's like a give-get. We're going to make this way easier for you. Please set some sort of passphrase. We're not going to make you reset it unless we think something's wrong. So set something memorable and solid and good. And you don't need to put all those goofy numbers and characters or whatever. It's way easier. So just type a phrase that's memorable to you and we'll call it good. Is that a good deal? And users will absolutely embrace that all day long. So if you do have cultural restrictions or just inability to extend that, I understand. But I think if you go back to your users and say, we are eliminating all of these requirements, which you really hate, but in return, we are going to ask for this one thing, people make that deal all day long. and twice on Sundays. That's a great deal for anyone. So obviously, longer is not always better, but I think there is a story where you can tell and teach users how to create passphrases with longer character lengths and the reduced other complexity to where that is still memorable. It's still compatible with the limitations of humans. And it gets them to set something that is truly unique to your organization, and they're not reusing it anywhere else because everywhere else still has all these goofy requirements and your organization's more modern than them. So they literally can't go reuse their password for their bank because their bank is still making them do a bunch of goofy stuff, like for example. So this actually helps you get out in front of it and ensure unique passwords when you relax these requirements, ironically enough, because then users can't take those passwords and use them anywhere else.
All right, so let's end the show with some practical steps because
we're all about
this whole
that.
thing is about passwords. But in reality, the best thing to do is, number one, relax your password standards, but then also try to reduce and minimize or eliminate passwords by using kind of like a roadmap here. So we're going to give you a roadmap. You might have already done some of this because Adam and I talk about this all the time, but go through this roadmap and start to reduce your dependencies and effectively eliminating the password without maybe, not without like eliminating AD or completely, but you can minimize the use of passwords in the user's daily life. So first off, you should be using SSO. So federate your applications with an identity provider, your SaaS applications, your internal applications. Entra is a great option. There are other ones out there, but make sure that you're federating, and then make sure you have desktop single sign-on. So that means that when you are on a desktop workstation and you go to an app that's federated, it single signs on into the application and that does not mean that you're going to eliminate things like MFA. So I've seen where companies will not want the user prompted for MFA because the IDP doesn't allow that in a desktop single sign-on fashion. We've talked about layering on different types of security signals. So just because we want desktop SSO to work seamlessly does not mean that you relax any other standards that you have. If you're using Entra, then on Windows, any Entra joined or hybrid Entra joined device will automatically SSO using an Entra federated application. And then we also have an enterprise SSO plugin for Apple devices for Macs and iOS devices. Specifically, I was more like thinking the desktop class Mac OS. If you have the device enrolled in Intune Company Portal, you'll automatically get the enterprise SSO plugin. So again, very easy to do. Turn on Windows Hello for Business, another passwordless method. So eliminate the need to enter in your passwords when you log into your desktop or laptop. It's a lot easier to deploy now with hybrid cloud key trust, or just have Entra join cloud devices and you can automatically use cloud key trust. It's just built in, very easy to use. So make sure you deploy that. That's one of the best ways to not only increase the security of your organization, but also win the approval of your users, because when you stop requiring them to enter in their password to log into their workstation, they're going to celebrate you. They're going to be like, hey, this security group is great. They allow us to use Windows Hello for Business. And then turn on passwordless in your Microsoft Authenticator. Whatever IDP that you're using, if you're using Entra, you're going to get the Microsoft Authenticator. We have the ability to have passwordless authentication turned on, where if I sign in to an application, it will just prompt me on my Authenticator for a number rather than having to enter in my password, then get the MFA prompt. So again, eliminate that need. You start using phish-resistant passwordless methods like FIDO2 and passkeys. Now you're increasing your security. At least go with your admins, right? At least to start. Now you're increasing that security to phish-resistant passwordless methods, increasing your security even more. I would highly recommend deploying password protection. Password protection is something that is built in with Entra P1. You can do it with Entra IDs, but also deploy it in hybrid mode, which then you can look at your Active Directory users and the passwords that they have. Now, the biggest thing to know with password protection when you deploy it is that it only works on when you set or change a password. So what I would recommend is deploying that first, and then think about stopping your password rotation, but think about it in the future. Plan for that, right? Because today you deployed password protection. Now everybody who is changing their passwords as part of your current policy will have to adhere to that password protection every time they change it or set it. And you can have custom lists within that password protection that's included in Entra. So keep your policy and maybe set it out to a year or something like that. So after a year, everyone will have changed and adhered to this new password protection that you've deployed. Then test it out and see, extend it another year or whatever time feels comfortable to you. And at some point, you can argue to management, or maybe you are the manager, to say, hey, there has been nothing that's happened. We've extended our password protection, which is how Microsoft did it. If you have ever talked to Brett Arsenal or heard him speak, he said the leadership was very apprehensive in getting rid of our password expiration. So he said, well, I'll give you a compromise. Let's just go 1 year instead of 6 months. Let's do 1 year. And if nothing happens, then can we talk about it? And they did. And after a year, nothing happened. And so Microsoft got rid of password expirations probably...
Boy, it's been 3-4 years now, at least.
At least.
Yeah.
I think it was prior to 2020, if I remember correctly. So anyways, turn it off. I even went to a conference recently, the experts conference that's hosted by Quest, and I was sitting in this session, and the person who was giving the session talked about the new NIST guidance, and then he said, I highly recommend that you still continue password rotation. And it was like the biggest facepalm moment for me, because I'm like, no, please don't tell people that, because the NIST standards say don't do it. And then it says, just change it in case there's a breach or a user request. But he was like, oh, I highly recommend you do it. I would highly recommend that you don't do it.
Do you want to be compliant with the standard or not?
Yeah. Now, I will accept the argument that service accounts are very difficult. Some people don't rotate their passwords for service accounts. Some people do. That's something that each organization is going to have to look at. But what I can say is what you should have done or have a plan to do is start moving those service accounts towards your GMSAs or service principals in, basically non-human accounts. If it's a service, it should be a non-human, non-interactive, does not allow login type of account. And then on a tangent, you should not be reusing your service accounts for multiple different services. Some people have some sort of general service account, and then they reuse it across a bunch of different accounts and services. Please don't do that.
Dear.
Yeah. And if you do, I would start thinking about a project to create more identities to start replacing those service accounts. So anyways, hopefully that's some practical steps for you. Adam, what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I love it. I kind of almost skipped to this section early on, right? When I was talking about, hey, we're going to help improve your password experience, but really the best solution is just don't use them, minimize the use of them. And that's what we're doing here. So this seems like obvious advice, but you still run into it. Single sign-on, all the things, federate every application. Even if you have old internal applications, there are technologies to take those legacy methods of authentication, like integrated Windows auth, and basically wrap it in modern technology. And that, what I just described, is available with Entra App Proxy, as well as Entra Private Access also does that, and many third-party solutions as well. So get all the things into your identity provider, deliver that single sign-on experience as much as you can. We talked on the past show how identity providers have a ton of intelligence built into them to evaluate refresh tokens and access tokens and make sure they're being used in the right scenarios by the right people. And if something is fishy, can pull them aside. That really resolves a lot of these concerns about why we used to think we needed to rotate passwords in the first place. The whole idea is, well, if an attacker's in there in the exact moment you rotate a password, you've just kicked them out. Well, if you're comfortable waiting 90 days to kick out an attacker, sure, in theory, but what if I can do that in real time or near real time? And that's what modern IDPs do. So there's actually a security benefit to it as well as the user experience benefit. Think about why the application 1Password is named 1Password. The concept is you now only have to remember one password, and it can be complicated and long. I think mine's like 32 characters or 20 characters. It's long. It's pain to type, but I rarely have to type it because I can usually sign in with biometric auth on my iPhone or Windows Hello on my PC. So it's rare I have to type it, but that's the promise. And same thing again, we go back to telling our users, hey, we're going to get rid of all these complexity requirements. And our trade-off is let's make it a little longer, was my suggestion. Well, what if you also said, we're also going to make it so there's fewer places where you have to type it in the first place. We're going to deploy Windows Hello for Business to your Windows PC. So you can sign in with a pen or your face or fingerprint instead. Okay, now you don't have to type it every time you open up your laptop. That's a win. We're going to build all of our apps into our single sign-on platform, so you don't have to sign into them all the time. That's a win. You're getting rid of all the times you're even asking users to type it in, which is also going to make them more willing to set a complex, long, hard to guess password, which is ultimately the goal. Users are going to make it simple if they have to do it all the time. I will say one of the passwords I have a hard time making super long and complex or even putting in a password vault is my Apple ID password, because for some bizarre reason, Apple still makes you type your Apple ID password. Sorry, they're called Apple accounts now, all the time. And it's one of those where I look at it and go, I can't make this too long or too complex because I have to type this on my darn phone all the time. And I wish Apple would get with the program, because that disincentivizes me from making it long, making it complicated, putting it into password vault. Same story here with your users. The promise you're making to them is you're going to have to put this in way less because we're going to do all of these other things. And I like how Andy talked about, again, if you're building in like multi-factor authentication into your sign-in flow. When I open up my Windows PC, I sign into Windows Hello for Business. I've already satisfied that MFA requirement. You're not relaxing MFA. It's just getting passed through automatically. So everything requires MFA all of the time. I just don't see an interactive prompt for it. That's the dream. That's the goal. And then you look at things like passwordless and Windows or Microsoft Authenticator, as well as passkeys. The promise of them is phenomenal. So now in those other scenarios, I'm on my iPhone, I'm on my Mac, whatever, I have a passkey I can use to sign in as well. That is beautiful when we get to that point. And then password protection is now a shall in the NIST standard. You shall look for these sorts of things. You almost certainly own this. And you can use this even if you're not using Entra as your identity provider. It does not require it to be your primary IDP to use this technology, but you own it. If you're a Microsoft 365 E3 customer on up, you have this today. And so there's really no good reason not to deploy it. And I like how Andy talked about, hey, I know we're talking about just stop rotating passwords, but you at least need one more round of rotation for that tool to have impacted all of your users' passwords and make sure they're on the up and up. So you need to bake that into your planning too. And I like talking through the historical idea of, okay, if you're not willing to completely go cold turkey, push it out to a year and see what happens. See if anything blows up or if somebody starts screaming, which is, always the most effective IT testing methodology. But it's a great first step. If you can go a year, then you're like, we're good. And that was exactly our experience. We originally got the announcement, hey, we're pushing this out to a year. And then a year later, we got the announcement, yeah, we're just not doing that anymore. And I have no clue what my Microsoft password is. Like literally my corporate password. I know this is like a meme of Microsoft employees saying this, but I'm dead serious. I don't know my corporate password. I would have to reset it if I needed it, but I don't need it anytime, anywhere at all. And that's a really good place to be. Some great actionable guidance here. Not only snapping to these standards, but other ways you can reduce the impact of passwords in your environment, the usage of passwords in your environment. And then that helps you build that momentum to implement these and really get that big win of the enhanced security that comes with reducing the usage of passwords. but also moving your users to a better model. And above all else, the security wins. You get the productivity win. You get the internal adoration, maybe is too strong a word, but you get a lot of internal respect for, hey, look at this. Cybersecurity is enabling the business. What a concept. Instead of being Dr. No and blocking progress, you're now enabling it. And that is seen as a huge win. So there's some wins out there for you, listeners and viewers, to go achieve with this change now. And armed with this information, you can go to your leadership and start banging the drum to get modern on your password strategy and requirements.
Yeah. And just because we're minimizing, we're not really actually eliminating passwords. Like you said, Adam, we still have a corporate password at Microsoft, but we never use it. I said it 3.5 years ago when I came back to Microsoft, and I haven't touched it since. Now, you're saying that you don't enter it in. The last time that I actually had to enter it in, which was within the last 3.5 years, I had joined another tenant, a B2B instance, using my Microsoft credentials, which is allowed, right? Like we can sign into our Microsoft using our Microsoft account to sign into another tenant. But that tenant, that organization, had not configured their authentications with passwordless. And so the first thing that happened when I tried to authenticate to that organization was it prompted me for my password. And so immediately I paused and was like, that's different. That's interesting.
Is this legit?
I've never seen that. And exactly, I asked myself, is this legit? Because we're never prompted for passwords. So it was an immediate flag for me as an employee to think about, am I really signing into something that I should be signing into? Should I be putting my password in this? And so what I did was I contacted the organization. I said, hey, have you configured passwordless? Like, I'm just making sure that we're signing in legit, and it was a legit sign in, but what a pain, because every time it asked me to authenticate to that organization if I needed something, and every single time it asked me to put in my corporate password along with an MFA prompt.
I wonder what would happen today now that we require phish resistant sign-ins. Like you can't choose to sign in with your password. It won't work. It's not an option now. I wonder what would happen.
I don't know.
That'd be interesting to see how that would impact it, because today, I mean, talk about minimizing the use of passwords. Yes, I don't think they've deleted them from the directory yet. I know Entra team at one point plans to ship the ability to literally remove user object passwords. It hasn't happened yet. You can do it for your Microsoft account, your consumer account today. That's been available for several years now, and I did it. But it's to the point where our sign-in policies do not allow it. So it's like I can't use it anymore for cloud sign-ins. I mean, maybe there's some on-prem system where I could force myself to get prompted if I tried hard enough. I don't know. It's weird to even think about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think we would be prevented because we're required for passkeys to sign into our Microsoft corporate assets and information. But when you authenticate to another organization,
it's their policy.
It's their policy.
Good point.
So I think we would still be able to use our creds with like password plus MFA if that's how they had it configured, because we're not accessing our stuff, we're accessing their stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. I wonder if that's one of the like sticking points with being able to remove passwords from user objects entirely, is if flows like that break and there isn't a, it's an engineering problem now to build a failback and communicate that to those orgs and so on and so forth. That's interesting. There's always downstream impacts from making changes like that. So,
well, great conversation today about passwords, our favorite topic. Hopefully you learned something. All the notes will be in the show notes. Our contact information will be there as well if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.